So today I'm going to be presenting the overrepresentation of poor mental health within police in a critical realist approach, which is my PhD thesis for Cardiff University. So let's start. So first of all, because we've been talking about stuff like suicide, I want to put a bit of a trigger warning on it. It does deal with issues of poor mental health, trauma, suicide. If you do feel you might be affected, just please consider your well-being before proceeding. Basically, your well-being is my priority. There's no questions to worry about or ask. You know, some of the stuff can be a little bit tricky, so please just bear that in mind before you proceed. Okay, so just to give a little bit of context regarding this presentation. So I was a police officer for 19 years and I started in 2003 and I got medically retired with poor mental health myself, kind of PTSD. And I then latterly conducted my MSc at Cardiff University, which then I managed to get a funded ERC PhD at Cardiff University. However, the master's I managed to, for my master's dissertation, I completed 17 unstructured narrative interviews interviewing police officers, which identified that primarily it was the organisation that was causing them harm, not what I would call traumatic events. And that led me to obviously proceed with my PhD. Previously to that, I was a Time to Change champion, and Time to Change, I don't know if you're aware of it, was a social movement which sort of ran from 2007 to 2021, and it was raising awareness of mental health. And within policing, that awareness, I think, took hold, and that was, for instance, with Farrah Christmas getting arrested down the bottom, that was a Time to Change village I created for police officers at the University West of England who were doing their training there to have sort of positive talks and raise awareness about mental health. But I think that kind of awareness through that kind of time, especially around sort of 2015 to 2018, really sort of took hold within policing. So there are two major studies which were kind of done really. My first was Mind 2015. Which identified that 91% of police personnel had experienced stress, low mood, poor mental health whilst working for the police in England. And Police Care UK, which is a national police charity, which I also volunteer for, reported 41% reported around about half the time exposure to traumatic incidents involving fatality, serious injury in children. And then obviously with COVID, 69% of emergency responders felt their mental health deteriorated due to the pandemic. So I obviously having been gone through a mental health, ill health retirement process myself, I've seen lots of colleagues become ill when they were very fit and healthy when they were young. And these kind of stats, I was really concerned about what was going on in policing for this to potentially be a massive overrepresentation of poor mental health. So having identified from these cross-sectional surveys that there's potential mental health amongst officers, the aim of my PhD was to identify the causative mechanisms, to move beyond what I would consider what Dan and Mark and I'll talk about is methodological individualism. And I think within critical realism, that's a very powerful tool. So rather than, just survey research or semi-structured interviews where you're just, your point of gain evidence is the individual, you also can fall on the relationism aspect, which I'll explain a bit further. So what do we mean when we talk about mental health and police officers? So as Andrew Sayers says, so much depends in social research on our initial definition of our field of study and on how we conceptualize key objects. So for me, it was not taken axiomatic that, what, mental health and policing were things just to roll with. I wanted to question that. And I think that's Sarah's got a really important point. What constituted the emergence? And having just read a little bit, if you look at Michel Foucault's book on madness and civilization, He highlights how, for instance, mental health is conceptualized with different epistemes, different periods of times. So I wanted a more rational abstraction, which Sarah talks about, rather than a bad abstraction, which kind of arbitrarily divides unrelated problems. Reading a bit of Zizek, which I can at times, it also questions, is this a problem at all? It doesn't take your initial problem as axiomatic. So what I use the literature review to conceptually abstract through the literature review. So I kind of had these kind of main topics. What is mental health? What do we mean by that? And actually well-being, which is the other side of what is well-being, rather than just kind of take these things as axiomatic. Police culture, police masculinity, and the emergence, like I sort of alluded to, of police mental health within the kind of policing profession. A major piece of underlaboring has been Professor David Pilgrim's book, Understanding Mental Health, A Critical Realist Exploration. This really did help me with the backbone of this research. And within this book, it, Professor Pilgrim basically says that psychiatric diagnosis is undermined by its overwhelming emphasis on symptoms, what the patient says and does, whereas with physical medicine, you can have the point of privilege and measurable bodily signs. You can X-ray a broken leg. Psychiatric diagnosis, when you go for a mental health state exam, is defined by ultimately subjective opinion. And within psychiatric medicine, there are two dominant classifications, the DSM and the ICD. And psychiatric, the potential ambiguity around diagnosis, the label people can embrace by it, but they can also potentially be misdiagnosed and destabilized by it. So within this book, Pilgrim basically says that, it's okay. We can look at the kind of classifications as demi-regular because they might have different causal roots underneath, but actually ontologically, it's more stable to look at misery, madness, and incorrigibility, which for this research of investigating mental health in police officers was really important because rather than, which I think a lot of researchers potentially make the epistemic fallacy of just taking, for instance, the kind of diagnosis from the manuals as axiomatic, it kind of boils it down to a more ontologically stable basis, really, which I think for the research, when I interviewed police officers, rather than say, do you suffer from trauma or have you ever suffered from mental health, the participants might not even know that they are suffering, or if they might be suffering, they might be misdiagnosed. So it's unreliable. So I basically went with, tell me what's made you feel good about your life and policing career, which I think is quite original, taking this research forward. The primary piece of research really is by Dr. Jessica Miller, who has worked for Police Care UK. And Miller is very it looks at biological determinism via neuroscience, and it's very kind of medically informed. The book is an excellent book, and I would recommend it to any police officer who is going through policing because it aims to kind of increase resilience. However, as we will know, people like Archer's criticised, if you're only looking at, when we're looking at the laminated ontological strata, which I will talk to you in a minute about, then it's a form of potential conflation because it's obviating multifactorial causation. A very interesting point at which that only in a meeting last week with Police Care as a volunteer, they will only deal with harm related to policing. Basically, what that means is if you have a kind of trauma from going to a fatal road accident or a sudden death, then you can go to Police Care UK and they will help you out. However, if you have organisational harm from the organisation, they won't help you out, which is quite concerning because from my research, the overwhelming harm is via organisational relations. So another key piece of literature that I came across, which I think is very important, is looking at the organisational stressors in policing since June 2004. And they highlight the difference between what they call episodic versus chronic organisational stressors. So episodic, like I said, is the traumatic incidents, the road traffic accidents, the sudden deaths, fatalities of children. These are kind of episodic. Whereas chronic episodics are basically lurking and constantly always there. So organized stressors you'll have every day, whereas episodic are low but high intensity. So the reason why organized stressors tend to be more harm is because it's the constant drip, drip, drip effect. And this paper is really interesting because it eliminates the primary prevention. So to reduce sources of stress and poor mental health within policing, you want to try and get rid of that constant chronic organisational stress. Whereas secondary intervention and tertiary intervention, where you're looking at therapy or kind of well-being through mindfulness, these are kind of aftercare type pieces of support, which are brilliant, but you're not actually tackling the primary prevention, which is organisational stressors, which this piece of research that I've done highlights. So looking at police culture, so for those who don't know, so since the 1950s, police culture has been an academic study, and that's where I really caught the buzz for my academic study. And I read through what I would call the classical policing studies on police culture. It's very qualitative, ethnographic study like Banton's work. Sorry, not Banton, like Loftus's work or Simon Holdaway's, and also Robert Reiner, who did qualitative research in the 70s. And Banton 1964 identified that there's a policing mind, or Skolnick in 1966, a specific police working personality. So working within the cultural environment creates a particular mindset. And the predominantly is you have cynicism, solidarity, and isolation. And officers can go from these kind of new centurions to uniform carriers. But there's a kind of paradox, I suppose, because the original police culture said it was kind of like a homogenous, whereas now it's multicultures, but with the same typologies. And I think through CR, recognizing, the sedimented nature, as Archer talks about in her 1995 work, for analytical individualism, institutions form the bedrock of social practice, clustered resources and conventions. So for the notion of demi-regularities within CR, it kind of can explain why we might have different cultures, but very similar typologies. But yet again, this is qualitative, so it's looking at individuals and negating some of the structural causation around. So Skalatsky 2007 talks about cognitive burning, and that's where a lot of the police researchers have come, and quite rightly, looking at like Reiner 2000, looking at the mode of control and governance around policing, and Cockcroft 2020 talking about talks about policing sociological examination of police culture being conducted in a rather negative or critical mindset, which is great if you wanted to try and look at the kind of harms done by police, but it's totally obviating and negating the understanding of why police officers are burning out, why they're so overrepresented mental ill health. And actually, I think that's quite important. If you want a professional police service, then you need a healthy workforce. It starts from there. So for me, that was another interesting absence, a determined absence, I would say, that police culture is really kind of negated to consider what's really going on ontologically for a lot of the officers. So within my position, I considered myself, with my extensive study, my 19 years research, as what Brown would call an inside-outsider. And they talk about four permeations of police researcher. Like an outsider, somebody who has nothing to do with police and goes to research the police, somebody like Robert Reiner, for instance, or an insider might be, I don't know, somebody taking their policing degree and doing their dissertation within the police, or an outside insider, somebody who is a researcher and gets employed by the police. And each position gives a potential different ontological lens on what you might see as a researcher. If I was honest, and I think a potential weakness of this research, I felt quite cocky, A, with having CR and having that philosophical background, and also to be an outsider, because I've lived those typologies, lived through it. Uh, but through sort of retrospectively thinking, sometimes I think there is too much emotionality there, and sometimes there is potential that I won't pick up on things that other people would, because that for me would appear as normal. So the one thing I kind of learned from research, you don't really get a free ride. There's always a bit of a but. So reading through well-being. So well-being in mental health, I kind of looked at it as a bit of a chaotic concept coin, really. But going for the reading, there were kind of three basic tenets of it, really. First was hedonic pleasure, which may be delayed for, like for instance, doing a degree, you might delay that gratification, but we all kind of need that pleasure in life. Eudaimonic purpose and our sense of flow. And beyond that, if they get, if you achieve that, you can achieve what Early Lang would call ontological security. So you kind of feel like all your ducks are in a row, things feel sweet, life is going where you want it. So those were the kind of three basic or four tenets really that I kind of based this research on. And then obviously the counteract to that, which is if you have fractured ontological insecurity, and there we have Professor Pilgrim's misery, madness, incorrigibility, and under misery, distress, sadness, and fear. So if things get kind of blocked by that or fractured, then the opposite will occur. So again, Pilgrim's been quite instrumental in this research. So he's in his 2021 papers got this biosocial model of well-being, and as you can see, these are the things that can make you physically and mentally ill potentially. All the factors which, when we look at kind of causation being multifactorial, makes sense. However, this research needed to look at and identify police-specific mechanisms, which is in the living and working conditions. So I identified really that life suffering is part of life. You're never going to get rid of it. And actually, there's a potential healthy part of suffering that helps you learn. We learn by our mistakes. But to try and identify what was it within the case study of this constabulary I was studying, what was it specifically going on with this constabulary that was potentially causing this overrepresentation of poor mental health. So I conducted my research design was a single constabulary, anonymised, I call it Sanford Police within the UK. I conducted 86 unstructured narrative interviews, which were great. They provided emotional ventilation for a lot of those participants, but they were heavy going and some of the material was quite difficult to navigate. I used, some of you might be familiar with Lader's 1998 adaptive theory, because unlike grounded theory, I felt that my position as an ex-police officer, as a researcher, there was no 0 point I could purely inductively come in. I wanted to own my social position as a social researcher and the backdrop I had on that particular lens. And that was brilliant because it enabled me to adapt two propositions throughout the whole process to test to see what the data was coming in, whether on what way that was going, and also to concrete into other pieces of policing stuff that was happening at the time to see if I was kind of going in the right direction. And obviously the philosophical scaffold of critical realism, which I think was brilliant, but it is a bit of a thorn in some ways because there's never really been an applied piece of CR looking at mental health and police officers before. So this is new territory. You kind of have to, I had to navigate my way through that. So obviously, for my methodology, Margaret Archer's morphogenic approach was really important. The Like, for instance, if you look at the classic book from Robert Reiner, Politics of Police, he talks about police culture, paraphrasing Marx, that people create their cultures, but not under conditions that are choosing. So, it's taking away that complete element of free will. It identifies there's a time one, which is structural conditioning. And then through the social interaction, people can either elaborate that structure or reproduce it. And it highlights that, if you look at just structure or you just look at kind of agency, without that analytical dualism between, you're potentially conflating either downwards or upwards, and running what we would call that epistemic fallacy. So Archer talks about personal, cultural, and structural emergence, which when we're looking at police culture, it's just looking at cultural emergence. So this is Bhaskara's laminated ontological strata, which is the levels of causation. So through that kind of background, it kind of helped me understand that police culture was conflating that whole structure. You can't say causation is caused by that one level either, and behavioral psychology is heavily used within the professional policing bodies. Psychology can't answer all the questions to why all these police officers are becoming ill, or any of the police cultural structural issues going on. So it helped me really kind of understand, I suppose, the multifactorial nature of policing and not to fall foul of going down, not taking anything as axiomatic, questioning it, looking for the necessary relations, but also, not then conflating a particular methodology with the whole strata. Interviewing. So looking at lots of police research, police officers, they suffer from cynicism. When they're being interviewed, it's normally in a quite an adversarial type situation. There's legal ramifications. They have to abide by the Police Criminal Envelope Act 1984. They have to deal with defence solicitors. So if you were coming along as a social researcher and saying, "Hey, I want to interview you," their experience is this is their common experience. So there would be a naivety, I suppose, if you thought you were going to go necessarily to a police officer and be able to have unbiased data, I suppose. So I lent on doing qualitative research differently by Holloway and Jefferson's. And I think they're saying something really interesting, that we must not assume a person's capacity to know. So quantitative structured interview, and we often learn what's true about nothing in particular. And semi-structured interview, obtaining and telling it like it is account, is rather unchallenged within social science. And there's an assumption that the person you're interviewing is rational. So for me, memory and a person's capacity to relay really potentially traumatic stuff or things they've not really considered or might not even understand was problematic. So they would advocate for, and this is what I did, is a unstructured narrative interview, gaining a narrative arc of that person's life. So tell me what made you feel good about your policing career in life, starting from when you grew up to where you are now. And I think that was really interesting. Moreover, like some further problems with the memory recall. So Robinson says, participants may have a problem with memory recall and might give biased responses. But looking Garland 2019 in their research, police officers have a spoiled identity. So if their identity is kind of embittered with the policing, what kind of responses are you going to get? And interesting, I don't know if anybody's heard about the Mandela effect. For instance, people obviously, like with the Monopoly, the little character there, they obviously remember him with a monocle. A lot of people in the 1980s thought that Nelson Mandela had died, but in fact, obviously, he didn't. So people's memory is highly problematic. And I think that assumption of just tell it like it is by Holloway and Jefferson is a really good critique. in the book, the trauma memory, the body keeps a score. Trauma is not stored in a narrative beginning, middle, and end. In fact, with some of the participants I interviewed, that was one of my original frustrations because I said, "Look, you tell me, what happened to you from beginning to end. I want that was my narrative, but actually, that kind of fragmented memory for especially some of the people that really, I would say, suffering the most, it was fragmented, but that actually was their narrative." So it's that was my kind of power imbalance trying to really the frustrations, but actually that was their narrative. That's how their traumatic memory um was affected. And for instance, if you look at September 11th, people can remember as or when Kennedy was shot, people can remember where you were on that day, but you can't remember the day before, and that's because from the book Body Keeps His Score, traumatic memory is stored in a different part of the brain. So obviously, the following Jefferson's was key. So I also understood this research from the three domains of reality. So for people who might be ever watching this who don't understand about critical realism, the empirical is obviously what we can see. The real are mechanisms we can't see, and the actual we might see it or not as they're activating, like the wave. You might see the wave of the iceberg coming up and down as it goes. So um, causal explanation is a desirable and critical aim in social science. So if you want to, I believe this, if you want to have a thorough piece of research, you've got to deal with the real and not just through, survey or semi-structured interview, just deal with what people might say. You need to look at the relations and what might not be potentially visible. And that's the real difficult part, I think, of it. So I think a really good example for me is this picture of an old World War II bomber pilot. And there was a really interesting statistician, Abram Ward, and these planes were coming back in the Second World War, and the red dots are where they were all shot at by the enemy. And so the answer was to put armor plating to build up so the planes were survived to build up armor plating where the red dots were. But this is a kind of survivor bias. And Ward come up and went, no, actually, you want to put the plate in where the bullets aren't. Like the engines, for instance, the pilot where the pilot's sitting and the gun turret at the back. Because the planes that never made it back, that's where the holes were. These were the survivor planes. So for me, my research, the red dots, for instance, they would be, I gained access to the constabulary, email went out to serving police officers, great. That would be all the red dots. These are the empirical, I can find those. But the where the white spaces are, I needed to consider officers who weren't there. What happens to them? Because then I'm going to get a deeper understanding of what happens to police officers' mental health. So as you can see, 21% were medically retired. Some had resigned, some had dismissed, and they were very interesting participants because for them, their policing experience had gone highly wrong. And 33% were still serving. So I had a complete spectrum really of different officers at different stages, rather than just going to the constabulary and trying to identify who was suffering from mental health. And I think that provided, circumvented some absence and provided a deeper point of study. So some of the findings were generally that police officers join the police from they're filling in an absence, and that absence comes with an unwritten contract to return. So there are three, and this was very consistent with a lot of the previous police research I read really, that officers generally join the police for financial security, excitement, or altruism, and that then that doesn't come for free. There's always, even with altruism, there's a expectation of reciprocal, like Maus, who's Durkheim students talks about, no gift is given truly. And for instance, this officer, so I was getting very frustrated with the management side of things. They were massaging the figures about how many crimes they detected. Well, let's be honest about it. That was all bollocks as well, because they were massaging the figures to make it look like they were doing better than they were. You've got to get 10 arrests a month. you've got to get 3 detected crimes a month. They want you to do 5 stop searches a month. Sorry, but in my eyes, that was a load of bollocks because we weren't a all-for-profit organization that's there to make money. It's all about the figures. Being a copper was about going out there, feeling colours, helping people. I didn't join up to be told you will get detected crimes. So this officer would have been about altruism, and trying to get out there and partially excitement. But when you can't do, when you come across organizational restraints, then you're going to get frustrated, cynical, and your mental health will struggle. So Archer in 1995 talks about organizational restraints, and I'll read you out about the financial. Basically, the financial crisis. Theresa May fucked us up, didn't she? I can't remember what it was, but I remember suddenly I passed all my exams for my inspectors and everything. Suddenly nothing happened, and it was just basically absolutely it stole the whole lot, and it was really, really hard. So this per individual, when we go back to those 3 tenants, they wanted to get their promotion. That promotion didn't happen. It broke their kind of sense of flow. Their unimodic purpose was affected, and that then put them in a position to suffer basically. Within the like police vernacular, we use the term job pissed, and there are lots of officers who are very addicted to excitement. All these circles could change as they went through their career, but I'll read these two out. But I think I would probably have joined the Dangerous Sports Club or something else because of the highs you get from the adrenaline rush in a blue light road chasing Stoveks and stolen vehicles. I always in my element. The adrenaline pumped. It was adrenaline filled. It played to my mentality like, hang on, we're out there. Let's go and catch the bad guys. So people joining the job are joining it for kind of felt dialectical tension, whether you want excitement, you want to make a difference for altruism, or you want that financial security. But when you hit the organizational constraints of the organization, that then can affect these 3 tenets of well-being. So how I kind of pictured it, you had constables wanting their kind of 3 tenets of well-being and trying to achieve ontological security, but the organisation is not an apolitical organisation. It has its own agenda, and basically it wants its own flow. It wants to, especially when you get issues of crisis of police legitimacy, it wants to try and make a closed system and wants to try and control things as much as possible because the organisation will work better then. So you've got this kind of rub. So when constables and the constabulary are working well, that's great. But when either the constable or the organisation change, then the gears can mesh. And constables were under a heavily, especially in this contemporary period, under a lot of control. I mean, it's a 24/7 job. You're in a role, you're a role model wherever you are. Yeah. And it dictates your whole life and your whole behavior. I don't go out pissed. I don't go pissed dancing on tables. But yeah, it's just so constrictive that somebody who's never done it can't completely understand how much. So, officers managing this, being aware of the potential surveillance they're under with their social media on the night, wherever they're going, that constant pressure, omnipresent threat of the organization needing to control them bears down on them. The biggest and most disturbing issue, I think, was Finesti investigations. I wrote a short article for Police Insight in 2022, and it feeds into that. It goes beyond annoying and mildly aggravating. It applies stress, and worse than that, for the application of stress, it means that when you do your job, you will no longer do it with the same flow or fluidity you could have once done it. Being under investigation, and even when you're not under investigation, it's that omnipresent threat that you've only got to make a relatively minor mistake and you'll be under investigation. So officers were reporting that it's not about committing gross misconduct, it's about a mistake that could happen, and the problem with that is you're trying to project into the future what, in hindsight, the decisions you make on the ground, do you arrest this person or not? Have I made this situation safe or not? Retrospectively, could be considered that you didn't do your job. So rather than through theory have an objective threat, i.e., if I go near that cliff, I will fall off. It's like working around. I know there's some cliffs around here that I've got to walk in the future, but if I've got to wear a blindfold, I don't know if I'm going to walk off or not. It's that kind of not knowing, that ambiguity, and ambiguity is bad because you can't make a decision, you can't decide. It's crippling, right? So the College of Policing, if an officer breached codes of conduct, they've breached this national decision-making model. And that is based on the free will choice and decision making of the constable, which, when we look at the morphogenic approach, would be a form of upwards conflation because yes, this person has personal emergent properties, but what about cultural and structural emergent causation? Is negating all the other levels of causation. And through the reading, PSD investigations, professional standard guidance set out by the UK government and the College of Policing is clear cut. The first is to maintain public confidence and the reputation of the police service. So reputation is the biggest issue. Second is uphold standards in policing and to deter misconduct. So deterrence is, we will know because most of us are criminologists, that kind of goes back to classical criminology. And that takes the assumption that we all have free will. But I would argue, through analytical dualism of virtues, we don't have complete free will, and you need to look at that again, a whole structural, multifactorial, laminated strata of causation. So police officers massively reported living within what I call the climate of PSD fear. And we live in fear. Every day I live in fear of losing my job through making a mistake. Not what I'm doing, but making a mistake. And I know so many other people who are the same. Somebody on my team, she's petrified. If I ever have a conversation with PSD about anything, she's always, was it about me? Was it about me? No, no, it wasn't about you. You're fine. But we shouldn't have to feel like that. And we were always told by PSD when they give those talks that if you make a mistake and you're honest, then won't be gross misconduct. But the minute you lie, it is. But in reality, it's not straightforward. So officers, it wasn't about creating a misconduct. It was about potentially what might be seen as a mistake. And that's why I got a picture of that pencil, because if we never made mistakes, we wouldn't need it, and we wouldn't need rubbers on pencils. People make mistakes. So you're worried about when your mistake is going to potentially be picked up. And that makes you hyper vigilant. It creates fear and anxiety, and it makes you become what we call a grey man. And if you're a grey man within the policing, you're not doing your job because you're not going to take that risk. You go to a domestic potentially, you're not going to potentially, you might let the other officer go forward to make the big decision, and you might slightly pull back, or you might not even answer the call because it's an easier call. So it's actually this climate of PSD fear, which comes, I would argue, from this deterrence model within the blueprint from the College of Policing, actually is detrimental to policing because it creates people who are risk averse and won't do their job. And the problem when you do go through a PSD investigation it's sadly that liminal space. If you think about, like I said, the three tenets of well-being, your hedonic pleasure, your sense of purpose, your flow, as soon as you go for a PSD investigation, they're all quite clean because it ain't fun being in a PSD investigation. You might not be a cop anymore, so your purpose is all in flux. And they're so protracted that they can take years. And you're in this kind of weird liminal space. And that is, the longer you're there, the more the less productive it is to your well-being. And officers did report that. The fact that PSD were looking into me, the fact that as well as that there was possible criminal investigation to me regarding an assault, the whole pressure of that built up, and I couldn't see any way out of it. And I just thought, you know what, I haven't got the strength to go through all that together. And I just thought, you know what, it's easier to just take some pills, go to sleep, and don't wake up because I won't have to deal with it. And that's what I did when I went home. I plugged a load of vodka and into myself and pills. So they were reading out all these allegations. This is officer who it wasn't just a PC. They gained some rank. So that your whole identity is in who you are. So they were reading these allegations out. I just switched off. My mind just went completely. My mind went to that escapism place where I was just trying to take control of the situation. And that was I was going to end my life because I wasn't going to be, I knew that what they were saying was untrue. It was elaborate, it was malicious, and I was mortified. I was embarrassed. I felt that my career was going to end. I was going to lose my job. I was going to lose my house. I was going to lose my husband because of some of the allegations that were made. And my brain just went off to another place. So I wasn't really listening to what they were saying. I was just thinking, as soon as I leave here, I'm going to drive my car into a wall or off a bridge or something. I was obviously in pieces, and the guy left. The investigator left, and I was left with my line manager who didn't really know what to say. And I've managed to concrete this in. So sadly, in Hampshire Police, two police officers have suddenly died. And PCC, the Police Crime Commission, Donna Jones, have written to her. She's doing an independent investigation. And there's a Channel 4 documentary talking about, PSD investigation, police suicide. So unfortunately, this is just not, I don't think, potentially located to this study. A major, or the only piece of work really on police suicide was by Armitage 2017. And as you can see from the diagram above, the darker squares are females and the light squares are males, but you can see there's kind of a mid-career point to that. And it identified that 50% of officers who died by suicide were or would be involved in PSD investigation. And there is a journalist, Eve, 2017, did a Freedom of Information request and identified it. Around about 30 odd of the police forces at the 43 in the UK didn't record any data on police officer suicide. And, that came out. There was promises of officer suicide data being recorded so we could try and bring this down. But as yet, there's still no official recording of police suicide data. So another issue with the PSD investigations is, maladaptive coping mechanisms, and with that, the observation of vicarious liability by the organisation. And I'll read out. And to whose standard do they measure? Discredible conduct in regs. To whose standard is discredible conduct? Because one person's behaviour could be reaching out for help and self-soothing. I'm not condoning it. I'm just simply saying what I don't understand is how discredible conduct. Say an officer smokes marijuana, right? And that was their way of coping with. They don't know they're coping with PTSD or they're coping with whatever it is, and that could be classed as discredible conduct with it. Without anything else, any genuine support, any genuine understanding of the exposure to high harm, and yet they could lose their job for smoking marijuana. So, Bullock and Garland, Miller, they all say that, coping with chronic stress, both physical and mental health symptoms, things like comfort eating, drinking, sex addiction, violence, extreme sports, all these can potentially be maladaptive coping mechanisms to the kind of your poor mental health, which is caused within policing. Yet, as soon as if this isn't picked up on, then that can then fall foul of breaching misconduct regulations. And there were officers there who didn't realise they were stressed or how they were coping, and only went to the dentist, for instance, to find out they were stressed because they were grinding their teeth, which is another reason why you use unstructured narrative interviewing, because people might not know. And potentially that this is a breach of the Equality Act, because if you've got officers who are suffering from mental health, that's a disability, and the breaches of professional standards is as maladaptive coping mechanisms. So, the analogy is the rotten apple. And the Casey review dispelled that, but the rotten apple analogy is well and truly used. Police officers are highly publicised. Even if you're found innocent, you can be through a highly mediated case. And Punch, the police researcher Punch, 2001, talks about the rotten, or we should be talking about the rotten orchard. And interestingly, Sayer, in his 1992 books, talks about it. Excuse me. Failure to recognize the existence of internal relations and structures can also be seen in an example of responses to criticism of the police. This is sometimes expressed and interpreted in terms of the presence of bad apples in the force. That is, as a criticism of particular members of the police. even when criticism is expressly directed against structures and positions, rules and powers which make up the institution of the police. It is sometimes, perhaps deliberately, misconstrued as being directed against the individuals. So PSD investigations were definitely the most emotive, damaging uh, theme, I suppose, to come out of the research. I won't be going through all of this, but organisational masculinity was another chapter and theme. I kind of lent on sort of Ram Hemp's work, and also has some good insight from Dr. Rachel Swan, who's my supervisor, about this policeman. So Ram Hemp basically says to try and navigate the organisational masculinity within the police, that female officers need to either lean on their femininity or their masculinity, and in each one actually can go wrong for them, because if you lean on femininity, well, you're kind of flapping your eyelids. If your masculinity, you're kind of butch, really derogatory stuff. And there's a kind of stoic strength, a kind of sense of being strong within policing. But rather than trying to look at this as a kind of like masculinity being kind of like a hydraulic pressure activates on everybody, the analytical dualism kind of picked in to try and unpick this to see where it was kind of going. And within the kind of masculinity research, I would often come across that, yes, this was derogatory and bad for women and could affect men, but it didn't say anything about men. So I looked through the research. Part-time female officers were blatantly, potentially made to work full-time hours, and that was problematic, because if you're working full-time hours, if you go on maternity leave, okay, and you come back, you have to work. The only job you can get is a full-time job, but you're in part-time hours. You're potentially going to breach your conduct again, because you're struggling to do too much. It isn't fair compared to the full-time employees. And also with policeman, if you subscribe to high masculinity or you didn't, that could also ostracize and make you isolated. And as social beings, if we're isolated, our mental health can suffer. So, for instance, policeman, I got involved in quite a toxic relationship with a nurse who had a propensity for violence, which I found out the second time she hit me. I left and I just said, right, we're done. I won't see you again. I've never told anyone apart from you and one of my friends and my counsellor. It felt very odd, I was this big bloke police officer who played hardcore, and I'm getting attacked at home. Yes, I was suddenly the victim. And I never like to be classed as the victim. So it was very strange, but I didn't know how to deal with it, how to handle it. Whereas I go to domestics all the time, and I did. And they're easy to fix, remove the situation, start dealing with it in that way. But when is you involved? So there were quite a few male officers who subscribed to high masculinity. They could be victims of domestic abuse because they were like, I can't be the victim. They were never going to seek help or support. And again, for officers who didn't subscribe to high masculinity, I probably imagine the way I talk. I'm probably more in touch with my feminine side than a lot of other bobbers. I probably have interests that I'm not particularly big on sports. I'm more interested in the theatre, film and television. And I'm probably quite different in many ways in my personality and my interests. And that's always made me slightly an outsider in the police, because of course, outside of the police, I'm almost my and I am almost my friends. I'm very, very typical. I don't shy away from fights. It's not as if I'm, feminine or gay or reluctant or wet in any way to sort of get stuck in. I was very happy to get stuck into fights. So once I proved myself, I think people stepped away from thinking that I was a bit wet and wasn't manly enough or strong enough to do the job. But I would have to get into a scrap to prove that I wouldn't accept me as red. So the kind of organizational masculinity, which is produced from the kind of crime mission, get out there to catch the bad guys, which is kind of prized compared to the kind of more softer, empathetic kind of relations women police, could make anybody of any gender isolated, basically. And the prize is this kind of stoic toughness. You've got to survive in that office, and the only way to survive in that office is to become part of what other people are, which is in the wrong way. Don't get me wrong, you wouldn't necessarily agree with the bullying or join in with the bullying. But did as my newly turned up little city central CID, did I go, actually, do you know what you're doing is wrong? You've got to stop it. And no, I probably didn't. Nobody else did either. But it doesn't make it right. No, it doesn't. That's what the sort of your lion culture does. You look on your prey and you make get together and make it sort of worse, a little bit worse and unbearable for them. So this kind of toughness within the police, which is born from the kind of masculine values, bashing the doors down, the thrills of chases, linking into that kind of excitement, it can ostracize anybody. And actually, this kind of fitting into that, you run with the pack, and if you're not in the pack, you become prey. So, cut a very long story short, I kind of the whole research, and then there's another chapter I've not had time because I didn't want to go too far over tonight. But I kind of recognize these kind of zones for police officers. Number one is that kind of excitement, that job piss police officer, and they're running around like a hamster wheel, and you're going to get, you can't keep getting the dopamine hits. You're going to crash and burn. Then you have people with a more balanced police identity. They're kind of their ducks were in a row. They're kind of hedonic, eudonic, and flow. And then you had like the liminal police space, which are PSD investigations, and also which I'm not talking about, medical ill health retirement. These are kind of the no man land weird zones you can end up in. It's really harmful to be there. And then something that no police officer can avoid is number four, the post police identity. Whereas if you're left in, if you've kind of hit those organizational restraints and they've not treated you well, you're going to be embittered, suffering potentially from moral injury. Or if you did manage to achieve it, you actually then also suffer because you kind of have a mortification of the self. Your identity's lost. So there potentially aren't any winners. So the implications, there are some implications. So I think it's an original piece of work. The findings challenge the official construct of the problem by senior management in policing and charitable bodies. It's squarely putting on its organisational relations overwhelmingly from 86 participants. But that's the core of this thesis. It identifies the locus of causation regarding participants' mental health as primary institutional and locates causation down to ontological security. So there are other pieces of research which talk about organisational factors, but because they're not using CR, they're kind of shying away from the causative nature of it. And this really kind of drills it down to those basic kind of well-being mechanisms and ontological insecurity. It builds on Holloway and Jefferson's unstructured narrative interview and by incorporating the meta-philosophical depth of critical realism and moving beyond methodological individualism. So, you've got the unstructured narrative interviewing with the depth of CR, which is looking at the relationism, which I think gives a kind of potential further step of scope for any other piece of research. And it provides conceptual clarity for the abstraction concerning the representation of police officer mental health, which is suggested to place the case study on more authentic footing. That's me done. So I will hand over and say if anybody got any questions.
Yes, Daniela, straight in with a question, please.
Yes, sorry. There was an awkward silence there, and I thought I might as well, because I did have a question that was running through my mind as you were talking. And you mentioned case study and then, loads of interviews. And I was wondering whether you implemented in any way a sort of analysis by level or anything to help you structure your analysis, to go from individual to, I don't know, relational, interpersonal, organizational. Did you do any of that, or did you just go by, what emerged from the interviews?
Yeah, so I mean, it sounds lovely, the 86 interviews, but I think there's part of me being a little bit over keen with that. And of course, every interview you get, it's not just one extra interview, it's like a mushroom growing bigger and bigger and bigger, and trying to get hold of that. And so I had this unwieldy, massive data which I had to kind of get a grips with. So the only way I could get a grips with it is NVivo. So I use NVivo 12. I use NVivo transcription, which I wouldn't recommend personally. That's cost me a lot of money, or cost the funding body a lot of money, and I didn't think it was particularly good. But having then transcribed it, I then coded it on NVivo. and there were quite a few. There were, and I think this was important, that there were quite a few codes that were prevalent compared to others.
Yeah.
So even though that people weren't, you can't really take 100% of what they're saying is they know, but when you kind of get in these main themes, so like with the PSD investigation, it was so strong, the people were being crippled by it. You could not identify that, right? So that's what kind of then you put it in the themes. But yeah, it was really tricky, and maybe in hindsight, maybe not so keen with it. But what was really nice about the interview, I mean, the interviewing was hard, and I think I would have to talk about, the researcher wellness, really. I was medically retired, and then when you're speaking to potential colleagues, within policing who have been harmed, that can resonate a bit too close sometimes. They're quite tricky, and that definitely was hard. Definitely was hard. But luckily, I had Adam and Rachel, and they were really good supervisors. But if I hadn't had good supervision, that could have been quite problematic, I think. The unstructured narrative interview was, I just let them go. I let them go with what they had to say. Like I was frustrated with some, when people, especially when they were affected, they were kind of all over the place, but that was their narrative. Sometimes I would just help them, just if they lost focus, to go back on it. But I think because they knew I was a police officer, it was kind of like more of a sharing experience, and there was definitely an element of emotional ventilation for them. And I did have some feedback from a couple of officers, and one officer, they'd been really mistreated when they were a student officer, really mistreated, female officer, toxic masculinity at its best, and that placed them within that kind of, they suffered from anxiety after that. But because they're so invested in the role, they didn't feel they were allowed to leave. So I was able to speak to them for the interview, and I had a text saying, "Thank you, Mark, for the interview. It helped me process what I've gone through, and actually I've left the police." And I think that's really helpful for that person, because that identity investment can be brutal, and even through this research and my kind of networking on LinkedIn, I've met officers that, for instance, going through PSD investigations, who, there's two, I won't name, but they were both, one was a PC, one was a high serving rank. They both were in a real bad place. And I met with them, one was online, one was for a coffee. And when I said, look, if you're drinking alcohol, if you're feeling suicidal, this isn't abnormal. What's abnormal is the situation you're living in. And you can see the light bulb going on, when they understand that this live situation, because you're in it. You can't see, the fly cannot see this way out the fly bottle, right? You can, because that's your normal. You work for this organization, that's your life. You don't make, there are political ramifications of police legitimacy, and we have that abstracted position. Whereas you can see the light bulb go on and go, oh, right. And even like, don't go back to work yet. If you've not been diagnosed, you'll go back to work, you want to prove a point, you might have an argument with the boss, you fall foul of PSD conduct, so please don't do it. Go to occupational health first. But sadly, a lot of officers are not getting that support, especially, through this kind of the main national charity only wanting to deal with episodic stressors. Thank you for that, Daniel.
I'm glad that you actually went into that a little bit, because my initial question was related to the overwhelming volume of data that you have at 80 something interviews. That's got to be very hard to make sense of. But the second layer of it is, you have to deal with 80 something people who go through stress and trauma, and it's something that you personally relate to. So I had something similar in my research, but I only had 17 interviews for one of my stages. And when I got to the last of them, which I thought was going to be, just one more, it's fine. That turned out to be like a 3.5 hours interview, where the person really treated it like a therapeutic session almost. And it's, it can weigh down on you if you've been through the same or similar things. So thanks for touching
Yeah,
upon that as well.
and I think, Danny, I think if I was in future, if I ever get to supervise a PhD, it would definitely be something that I would be very mindful of. I mean, I'm lucky with Adam and Rachel, but you do hear some stories from other PhD researchers who don't have such a supportive environment. And I think that, I think that the universities need to really be keyed into that. I know that we've been Cardiff, they've got this chief for wellbeing now, looking at the wellbeing researchers, and because some of the stuff, I mean, if you're research like I'm researching mental health for police officers, it actually means people might be affected before, right? So it means a lot to people, and they're heavily invested in it, and you're kind of on your own. Cool.
Thanks both. If
Who,
that's, do you want to move to another question now, Mark?
yeah,
Thanks,
please do.
Daniela.
Thank you,
That's
Daniela.
very, very stimulating. I think Nick had his hand up first, and then Jane.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Thanks, Mark. That was really interesting. I learned a lot then, and I got a very strong feel for the argument of your thesis coming through there as well. So that bodes well for the examination when that comes around. So well done on that. And like Daniela said, the data set is incredibly rich and expansive. So you've done incredibly well there to generate that data set. What I really liked about the presentation is the way in which you tried to situate an understanding of mental ill health by using organizational culture as the mediator within which we can understand the interconnections, say, between individual agency and some of those wider structural conditions that you made reference to as well. But then you also pointed out that police culture is no longer a singular monolithic thing, right? It's very diverse, it's varied. And if we take a very basic definition of culture or organizational culture, then what we mean by that is, say, the norms, the values, the assumptions that exist within these organizational contexts, right? So my impression from the research was that you identified, therefore, different combinations of structures and mechanisms that in turn generated these mental ill health situations. But did you identify commonalities across different cases of ill health? So while some people that might have been a product of, say, a PSD investigation, for other people it would be another reason, right? But were there common factors or reference across those different cases that you were able to identify? And then related to that, how did those different mechanisms actually produce that ill health? So you've identified there was a connection between these conditions, these mechanisms, but what was it that actually generated those events, if you like?
Yeah, I think the main mechanism, like I think I don't know if I alluded to it very well, was fear. Is that it would be very hard to understand what policing is like, but I think that the grey man. I mean, I can remember being told I had a problem at work. Mark, you need to be a grey man, not too good, not too bad. Having this kind of hypervigilance, keeping your head down, and so the common, whether it's PSD investigation or poor managers, whatever that would be, it was this kind of hypervigilance. So officer, you're living in a hypervigilant state. It causes a lot of distress, and that distress is ultimately, I talk about in the concluding chapter, like a tipping point. And you can imagine we're all a bridge. But all our bridges are slightly different depending on that resilience. But each bridge does have a tipping point, And there's a book by John Sutherland who's writes. It's called Blue, and he was in the Met, and he was a top flying manager, and he talks about he was at church services in America, and he writes something went twang in the back of his head. It was a physical sensation. He hit his tipping point. And it's that having that constant hypervigilant, that in that state, sometimes the stronger you are, the longer you can hang on to the bar, but you'll fall harder. And this kind of links in with that kind of that stoic strength. You've got to be tough. I mean, I felt it myself. You're the problem solver. You put the blue light on. You go to that job and you rock up, and everybody looks at you. I can remember that there was. There was a rock band Baroness once. It was raining, a rock band Baroness, and somebody fiddled with the brakes on the coach, the tour bus, and it went through a bridge. And there were people left, right, and centre, and I was there with the blues and twos, and you could see it in their faces. Oh, the police officers are right, great. We can all relax now. but I never had that day of training how to deal with a bus 30 foot off a bridge. So it's having that kind of like, oh, it's the unknown, and you're trying to future predict. So fear, definitely, that kind of ambiguity, it's layered within policing, that causes that distress level. Because I didn't really want to. I didn't want people to come and say, right, oh yeah, I have PTSD, or I'm suffering from any other particular form of diagnosed for the medical psychiatry mental. I didn't want to kind of go down that because of that potential ambiguity. I really wanted to look at that kind of base level, what made people miserable, and give them encouragement or even irrationality. And it was the kind of the way to working within this kind of organizational climate, which is which sadly is fundamentally organizational, which it would need a complete, to eradicate it, we need a complete paradigm change, which you're not going to do. So you're only going to slightly modify it or mitigate it. I don't know if that answers your question, Nick, but
yeah, really interesting. Thanks, Mark. Can I just quickly follow up on that fear point and the PSD investigations? And how did you go about disentangling intentionality in the interviews, in the sense that, yes, some of the people you interviewed, right, would have innocently or unintentionally been engaged in some kind of misconduct, whereas others may have intentionally been involved, right? But they may have presented themselves in a different way, because obviously it's better to present yourself as somebody who's made an error than it is as somebody who intentionally did something deviant in the organization. So how do you go about disentangling that? And did the ill health that came out of those different situations, was that still caused by the same underlying factors like fear, for instance?
So it's like comes about absence. I deliberately wanted to speak to officers who've been under PSD investigation, and some of them were sacked for gross misconduct. So they couldn't. They were like that guilt was there. They couldn't deny it. And that they were horrific cases, because I mean, I didn't put it. There's a really good, the kind of the problem with the free will element, just like with criminal law. You did this act on that day, boom. So you're a deviant. But we know through multifactorial causation and emergence that can emulate through years of for policing, through your kind of upbringing, to get to that point. So when I interviewed these police officers who have committed gross misconduct, there was always a sad story behind it. A very, their ontological security, they're fractured. I'll be cautious, but I'll give you one example. There was an officer who had committed a mistake, but they hadn't seen their daughter. They struggling to get a partner. They had tried to hang themselves. They were using alcohol. They had been quite affected by years of policemen within the role. So all these plates were not spinning, they're falling off. And they were 100% honest and went to and said, look, actually I've broken this rule here. I've done this. And they put them through a mediated court, in which you go to HQ, it's got wood paneling, media invited in, and they were dismissed very publicly. They live in a small place, all their details, the officer said, I'm never going to see my daughter now with this. People are shouting at me in streets. In fact, when I was there, their best friend phoned up and said, sorry, mate, I can't hang around you anymore. So, I mean, how I entangled it, I did deliberately hit that head on, and then looked at the kind of fractured ontological security these officers had. I think that's really interesting, because we don't want bad police deviants for good reasons, right? But unless we understand that it's not just about the last little incident, there's a build up to it, then only dealing with you're only going to deal with the tragic cases. Whereas actually, this gives a real good opportunity for police, because they can nip some of this stuff in the bud years before, if not before potentially recruitment, right? So you know, there's no win there weren't many winners in this role. You know, the people who succeeded, you know, they bereaved their police and identity, and once you left, you kind of like dismissed. You know, I haven't talked about in the presentation, but even with medical pensions, there's something called an injury and duty award. You know, and that's kind of pensions is quite lucrative, but through austerity, the constabulary went round and started reviewing all these officers. So even, you know, out of the police, that can still affect your mental health by causing anxiety. You're never quite in. Like I have a medical pension, you know, potentially that can be reviewed at any point. So still with this kind of, oh, you know, they can come back at you at any time. Thanks, Nick.
And I think Nick was also asking about commonalities in addition to the BSD investigations. So the patterns that emerged across the data and the way in which you coded it up, you know.
Yeah. I mean, they, like I said to Diana, they were really prevalent, and some of the common answers were quite high out there, and definitely like with the fear and the distress that was signaling off the roof.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Mark.
So Jane, please.
Thank you for that, Mark. Some of the narratives were for me very powerful. So thank you for sharing that. It sounds like a horrible place from someone who has not worked within the police and has not really interacted with the police. I have a question about maybe also related to Nick, about entanglements and whether these conceptual categories between the PSD investigations and some of the what appears to me quite toxic masculinity environment, whether these two categories are perhaps not so neat that they are maybe in a way entangled with each other. And by that I mean, you know, in some of the testimony that you've shared, someone obviously spoke about witnessing poor behavior, something that he normally wouldn't accept, but at the same time he or she wouldn't feel comfortable speaking up about. And I'm just wondering, you know, the possibility of actually some of those traits and some of the cultural environment which enables this type of conduct to occur may perhaps in some way also be related to the types of PSD investigation that are launched. You know, and some of the officers which may have been subject or targets of those investigations, that these categories are themselves, you know, interrelated. I would be interested in whether you have seen evidence of that.
Yeah, I mean, life is messy in a chaotic open system, so there are going to be crossovers. But there still were. I still think there is an element of neatness to it. That I kind of found. I think with this kind of notion of entanglement, I think I wouldn't dismiss that. But like for instance, the female detective inspector, you know, that potentially was going along with it. That primarily was down to the kind of the gender issue for her. You know, there was a load of old male sweats there, and you know, that they were basically kind of having this kind of lying culture which she didn't feel empowered enough to go against. I mean, I know them, you know, for their and they're an excellent officer. So yes, I think entanglement. I mean, I think you're trying to unpick the like it's like a ball of wool. You can look at anything and go, well, how far do you unpick that mechanism with that? You know, that entanglement. Where do you've got to try and take a thread out and take the strongest thread out of that, you know, and that's what in essence I've done. I've gone, right, okay, this string here, that's the strongest thread. PSD is very clear because why is it very clear? It hits all three tenets of well-being, because it comes down to what Archer talks about, your central concerns. Your central concerns, I mean, like Howard Zare, the criminologist Howard Zare talks about, if you're a victim of crime, you suffer a violation of the self. Why me? Why did you hit me? Why did you rob me? Because it takes away your element of control, your ontological security. And the PSD investigation, that police-specific mechanism is the strongest, most damaging piece of string or mechanism that can occur. Now, that can have gender elements to it, definitely. I wouldn't dismiss that because it's that big ball of wool you're trying to unpick. But these were the kind of the strongest themes. So I would, yes, but these were kind of very strong to pick out that kind of chaotic mess of what in essence is an open system, I would say. Perhaps I'm not answering it properly, but yeah, I hope that answers it.
Thanks. Daniela, is that a legacy hand or have you got another question?
No, it's a new question if I can. I don't know how much time we have today, but
Oh, we got plenty of time. Please, as you go.
okay, perfect. So I was going back to, well, I kept thinking about that paradox that you revealed, Mark, that everything stacks up against the police officers' ontological security whenever they're going through this investigation. So how do you propose, or have you given any thoughts or any, do you have any practical advice as to how this can be better managed? Because on the one hand, you have, police officers need to be held at high standards. Yes, okay. The way the law is enforced has to have a high level of scrutiny. On the other hand, you have to have support mechanisms in place and, organizational culture, and even to a certain extent that those stereotypical kind of roles and that kind of culture, although it tends to become toxic at some point, it's there for a reason. It can be protective as well, right? So how do you think police forces can better balance this kind of paradox?
I use a paragraph from Zizek in it. Sorry, Orlando, but it talks about it kind of, to cut a very long story short, that actually, that when we're talking about change, we're not often talking about paradigm shift change. We're talking about bolt-on change, to make it simple. So, like for instance, Casey Ruby, which identified toxic masculinity, said, like for instance, firearm officers, let's get rid of them. But it didn't go and say, right, well, perhaps we need a radical reshift of policing. So I think it kind of it elucidates to two. There would need to mitigate a lot of the harm from these from policing. You would have to change the paradigm of policing. That ain't going to happen. So then you come down to, well, what kind of mitigation can you create? And I think so. For instance, with the PSD investigations, they have a welfare support officer role, which is come, I think, from officers being suicidal when they're given PSD investigation, but it's volunteer. So these are volunteer officers. So rather than recognizing that they actually, if you serve somebody with a PSD investigation, that can be a contingent relation to them having suicidal ideation. They don't value that. They just will have a volunteer role with a police officer who will have their own workload, which when I was looking at episodic stressors, when police officers talked about episodic stressors, and that they did come up, they would often resonate. So, for example, I can remember going to a sudden death of a 30-year-old, and I was on my own with that. I got quite affected because the girl who died in her 30s had the same haircut as my partner at the time. It resonated. So, if you're in child protection and you go home to your children, that's going to like bounce off the wall. So, but with this welfare support officer role, there's no kind of worry about that kind of connection. If you're, and some of these welfare support officers would have been, been through a PSD investigation before. So like, I want to help officers out, but it might be a bit close to the mark. So, you know, one of the things I would advocate really is a kind of professionalization of this welfare support officer role to somebody who is trained in how to deal with people who are suicidal. I don't carry a workload. I'm not necessarily a police officer and have more of a medical background. Just recognize it and deal with it and accept it and support it. And I think also, I think nationally there needs to be better resilience around the kind of police legitimization and the cry for that. So within this research period, there was two horrendous criminals, Carrick and Cousins. We had the murder of Everard, and one was a serial rapist. They were Metropolitan police officers, bad criminals. The political reaction from the Met was to put 1,000 officers immediately under investigation, which equates to 1 in 34 officers. Now, knowing that these PSD investigations are caused in mental health, that seems highly problematic and seems more organisational in the problem than it does of the rotten apple. Because if you've got a rotten apple and 1 in 34 officers, structurally something's going majorly wrong, I would argue. So yeah, I mean, so there is a kind of some things that can't be changed. The research recognises the inherent fundamental nature of policing and what it can't change, but then there are elements within it that you can change. So if you understand about primary causation and you understand about the ontological depth, then if rather than just look at things through just trauma, like for instance with neuroscience, like for instance Police Care UK, and you look at all sorts of on that ontological strata, you're going to be able to get other wins to help people out. You're going to be able to mitigate harm better. So I think it gives in that element, it gives a bit of an advantage to policing. Whether that gets taken up, you're dealing with the kind of the power of sort of the police organisation. I mean, the College of Policing is the main evidence-based, police-led practice. Yeah, we've got no recorded data on police suicide data, even though that's been promised since 2017. So, evidence-based policing is great, but who decides what evidence gets put in?
Yeah. This is a difficult conversation, especially when there are so many practical implications to your research that I've got the same kind of question off the top of my head all the time, like how exactly is all this going to translate into practical advice and solutions and whatever, and there's a whole other layer there.
I mean, even coming to Simon's kind of point on writing a CR that's not kind of CR that people can understand. Another thing I would say, is like, yeah, I've got CR, look at this, it's great, I've got this lovely advantage. But then, and Adam and Rachel rightly, with my, you don't need all the jargon, take it out, make it applicable so people can understand and read it. And that I found quite difficult because when you start off, you let into this kind of garden of CR and it's all amazing. You've got all these kind of buzzwords, you understand it. And it's easy just to lean in on that. Whereas actually within this research, I kind of had to go, that's lovely, that's great. But actually I need to lean on what people are like the data. So that there's some really major learning curves for me. And it's not job done at all. It's ongoing practice, but yeah, interesting. Thank you.
I mean, this isn't, of course, even a mock Viva, Mark. Although I hope there's some. I've been making notes. Thank you, everyone. So some really good lines of investigation that one can anticipate in the real thing, in terms of your data and how you collected it, how you made sense of it, what its limitations might be, and so on. What a usual kind of thing you expect out of a PhD Viva. But part of the outro of those and a way of discussing, if you like, the contribution that it's making is your thesis. I mean, is where you see your work going as a consequence. The sort of questions and the future research program that's been opened up as a consequence of your thesis. There's another way of justifying it. Yeah. So what would you say? I mean, and more generally, where do you want to take your research here on out? as a consequence of this 86 interviews, which I should just say, I mean, I'm biased, of course, as a supervisor, but I do think it's a phenomenal accomplishment. 86 life history interviews. We're going to try and get that curated because it will be could be subject to subsequent very rich secondary data analysis, something the SDI initiative of the ESRC, I think we're very interested in. And I think almost unique data set, actually, I think, in recent times to get that kind of insight. Because there's all sorts of other things. I mean, I've had the privilege of having read this already, but it's, there's so much more, or just than the core questions of the thesis that you elicit through unstructured narrative interviews with these kind of respondents about their lives, about the job, about the interaction of that, about what is fundamentally an ontological rather than, to pick up on one of Nick's questions, I know he didn't mean it this way, but he was, I think, prodding you on this, a more narrowly juridical concept of what is the cause, and how do you kind of make sense of that. So much there, yeah. But where would you like to take this ideally here on out?
Yeah, well, I'd like to put in a book. And I've met with Tom Sutton, who's part of our group, and I think after the we'll be putting a proposal up. I've always wanted to do that. I mean, the first spark, I remember going to my first, was an undergrad lecture on police culture. I was a university cop at UWE, the University of West of England at the time, and I was met with like police culture and lots of Banksy pictures. And I love Banksy, he's a Bristolian, but it didn't resonate with my experience. And ever since that presentation, I've always wanted to write a book on it. I've networked with another academic at University of Cambridge. They've done it's not the same, but they've come up with some sort of organisational relations, being a primary course as well. With them, we're looking to do some joint writing. I would like to do a methodological paper on unstructured narrative interview in ontological depth. I think that, like with the network, with the methodological the methodological views that Daniela did, that I think there's a real thirst. I've always been really concerned because I found it tricky getting into this and still find it tricky with the CR world. So I've always got a concern for the people who are following through really and trying to make that path more streamlined. So I'm very interested in writing about that really. But there's a data set of 86 unstructured narrative interviews. That secondary data initiative, it should be really good. There's lots of prospects where I can go with this. Would like to get an academic position first of all. That would be quite nice. So yeah, that's my kind of paying the mortgage at the moment. It's a bit of a concern. So yeah, lots of, and really exciting, and a really good and continuous learning process. I never thought I'd go through really.
Okay. Well, I mean, and also, unless there's no other kind of questions people are formulating there, just to say, I mean, something we've discussed is the tension between context and generality then in these, and how far you can infer things from the particular case study force that you looked at,
Yeah. Well, it's vertical abstraction, isn't it? So, but also with that kind of, there's a few police researchers with different pieces of research. I could be very interested in, when we look at the PSD investigations and the kind of media exposure, I'm really concerned for the children of that. If mum or dad's on BBC News for this or that, there's no kind of consideration for the children around that. So I've got an academic in America looking at writing with that. Like I say, I've got another academic at Cambridge University that we're looking at writing a joint paper on organisational relations. So there's I do love networking, hence why I run a network. So lots of exciting possibilities, really. But first of all, I do have to secure some sort of position and pay the mortgage.
Daniela, another question. Thanks.
Yeah. So it's not a question this time. I was just wanted to say to Mark that I'm in the process of exploring what am I going to do with my research. What does practice kind of advice mean? How would it look like? What's kind of methodological output I could outputs I should be looking at. So these are conversations that I'm always happy to be part of. So yeah, just happy to extend this kind of work. But yeah, you're right. We first have to ideally get a proper job.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite an overwhelming time because you live for this PhD thing and it's just all consuming, and all of a sudden you're kind of done and you're like, okay, right, okay, where exactly? I mean, there is a bit of fate with it, but there's also, but yeah, unfortunately, like with the university's in a bit of a recession, and it's not the best time to be doing your VEEV and stuff. And I think there's a question, Adam, from Simon.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Really enjoyed that. Really, really interesting and very professional presentation, I thought. I just wondering, following on from some of Adam's points about where you want to go next with this and where you want to take your research. You mentioned a book, obviously, and that would presumably be an academic orientated book for other academics, other researchers, and so on. I was wondering whether you've thought about how you might disseminate your findings within the police or for the police as well, and to what extent that would be well received, or how you might go about doing that. Who would read some of those findings, and how might that change some people's thinking, perhaps in senior positions in College of Policing or wherever they deal with policy and that sort of thing. I just wonder if you thought about that at all.
Yeah, so two things really. I volunteer for Police Care UK. So every now and again I'll probably go to a HQ and I'll raise awareness with that charity, and I was helped out by Police Care UK, so I'm very pro them. But like last week, they made that kind of demarcation of not dealing with episodic stressors, only dealing with episodic stuff, not organization, and I think quite rightly pointed concern around that. So I kind of working from inside in that charity, but also within LinkedIn, I've probably got a few thousand officers of different constabularies, and I've made quite a few networks with other police officers who are doing PhD. So disseminating that research out via sort of social media. But I would like to contact the constabulary I used. I'm meeting the police crime commissioner of that constabulary in future, when there are local forums. So really trying to get like a grapple on that to see where I could go with it really. But I've literally just written and submitted the thing. And it's just like you kind of swimming. It's like you dived in the pool and you're swimming, trying to go, right, okay, where am I going? There's lots of stuff on the go. And I'm at that kind of point really. But yeah, it's really exciting. And there is a kind of I suppose there's a little bit, I've got a residue of being a cynical old cop where you think, well, actually some of these structural kind of relations are so embedded that, are they going to want to change that? And it's very easy to go down the road of like, no, they're not going to want to change that. And there will be people who will be, I would imagine, be resistant to it. But equally, and that's quite a universal statement. So I know that, it's finding those people who really want to bring in change, and well-being and mental health of police officers is being talked about. I do feel that the lack of, I think CR gives it a good foundation to understand, to grasp the nettle on how to start tackling this issue. Whereas if you have the epistemic fallacy of just going down to behavioral psychology, neuroscience, or any other kind of singular epistemology, you haven't got, you're trying to stretch that too thin. And I think you can see that in other pieces of research. And there was one research talking about emotional ventilation of officers. That's really important, but you can't just, that isn't going to resolve it. You've got to come back to that, that primary causation again. And I think this really does that. And I think that's what's original about this research. I think it says what it is on the tin. It's been quite honest from the start. And I feel it's not perfect. There, of course, I could have another 4 years probably. And that, but I think Adam would be bored to death of me. I think I've given enough stress over the years. But I think it does what it says on the tin. So to that, I would think it's sort of job done really.
But
The
I think
legal will.
analytically, what's kind of interesting out of this, the questions that Danielle has been raising, Simon, others, is to put it more formally in CR terms, is the practical adequacy of the research or the aspiration towards practical adequacy. I think there's a lot in there. It's actually about practically adequate knowledge. But that's a kind of predictable line of questioning that you might get certainly from other CR people, if not actually in the Viva Voce itself, and subsequently, and that is a key justification, isn't it? And a really interesting point, practical adequacy needn't just be something that could be accomplished tomorrow, as it were, or even over a period of time. It can also be about establishing what the limits of alternative practices like cognitive behavioral therapy might be, if we wasn't to take into consideration, to reference the quote you were making from Sayer, the internal relations, the structural questions, the material conditions which can generate this. So do you know what I mean? I think that's the kind of response that's partly the response to that as well. The fact that something could, significant change, which you thought would really address the key causal mechanisms, the fear, as you put it amongst that, would take a fair bit of time to come in, is not an argument for an intellectual piece. Certainly, it's something submitted for a high degree, not to make that argument or address those, because to address it would be to introduce the reality of the problem, right? And would be not to be true to the ontology of the problem. So I think, yes, practical adequacy is important, okay, but you can approach that actually from a number of different routes. You don't have to be, you don't have to be craven about wanting to affect change. The old thesis on Feuerbach stuff. Philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. Okay, but which is a kind of smart, neat thing for Marx to argue. But I mean, the point is that it raises further questions, isn't it? The possibilities and condition for affecting that change, how soon, et cetera, et cetera. But nonetheless, still, the value of interpretation, the value of philosophy, the value of really being true to the power relations, which make the thing in question, organisational drivers of mental ill health, possible, is the answer.
Yeah. And I think some of those issues is really something I'm very interested in. One reason I found your research interesting, Mark, is just the political positioning of research like this. Like, where do you situate yourself, not in terms of left-right politics, but in terms of the thing you're studying? You talked about it with a lot of nuance and insight about, you could approach this kind of research as kind of an aggressive outsider saying, look, the system is failing, institutional failures, almost a sort of critical criminological perspective on these sorts of things. Or you can be more of the tame insider who's just trying to work for the police or for whatever institution it is and trying to sort of do things that are going to be in their interests and for them. And then I think, as Adam and as Gordon and others have pointed out in the past, the kind of critical friend approach where you're not subservient and you're not just doing what people want you to do, but you're also not just being hostile for the sake of being hostile as well. And I think your research seems to tread that really carefully. So I thought that was interesting too.
Yeah, I mean, I've got within my own force I work for. There was one of my good friends, Alex Rakes, is an equality director, and she would call herself a critical friend because she's friends with the constabulary, works with the constabulary, but actually if they fall foul, will be critical of it. And I think that is a nuanced approach to take, and I think it's very easy to fall into kind of different positions, and it is kind of polarized positions. But actually, you've got to try and work and help people along that kind of journey. And definitely, I think with my kind of policing background of going to situations and seeing people sometimes in very polarized situations, I'm right, now I'm right, and you kind of bridging that divide. I think I'm quite skilled and averse, or would hope I am, at trying to help people sort of come to understand for that kind of middle ground area, really. But it's tricky because like with that meeting within police care, I had quite a strong criticism with that. That could alienate me potentially, but I equally talk with a lot of warmth about police care as a charity because it helped me out. It helped me out with my lowest times. So, it isn't. I think in Denmark et al. They talk about that kind of polarized sort of dualistic thinking is not either or, it's both and. And I think quite that dialectical tension you've got to kind of sort of craft your way through it, and that's not always easy to do. But then if it was easy to do, we wouldn't be here, would we? Thank you, Simon.
Yeah, so no question from me, Mark, as I've been lecturing all day and don't have the capacity at the moment, but I would just like to say how impressed I am. That presentation was cool, calm and composed. It's great to see how far you've came. You're clearly an expert in your topic, and it was really great to see how you've managed to translate all of this from what was quite conceptually heavy stuff into really accessible common language, but you're still managing to dip into and out of the essential concepts as and when needed. So I'm sure that you're going to completely smash this Viva, and well done for tonight.
Thank you, Orlando. I definitely think something I didn't appreciate was the kind of starting off is how important the relational aspect of the CR would turn out to be, because it really was a way of concreting in, using your judgmental rationality and concreting in, that yes, that knowledge is practically adequate, but you've got these, concrete examples, for instance, like that, we're talking about PSD, like that Channel 4 documentary come out, like the fact that the PCC is also in Hampshire, doing independent inquiry. Well, it kind of, you're concreting in what you're saying a little bit, So yes, it's going to be practical adequate. There's always potential for hidden mechanisms, but there is a direction the juggernaut's generally going in.
I think that given that you've got such a rich data set of 84 interviews, you've probably got enough data for in the future when you do transpose it into a book, or if you want to think about other articles, that I noticed that you hadn't used Eldervass 2010, The Causal Power of Social Structures, his first book. Chapter 7 is simply on organizations. And I think obviously it's too late now, and you've clearly done incredible thinking around Archer's morphogenesis and the laminated reality approach. But for me, chapter 7 on organizations in Eldervass's 2010 Causal Power of Social Structures is a very, very neat, focused CR on the causal power of organizations, and it would get you in and out with minimal scratches and bruises for anything if you want to repurpose your data with a different style of CR.
Thank you, and that's definitely worth looking up. Thank you very much.
Cool, yeah, no worries.
Yeah.
You can get rid of Zizak then.
I just put them in there because I want to see you have a nervous twitch generally.
Yeah, it's done it.